Well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Professor Anton Allahar, for his ultimate lecture. I'm sure you'll all share my enthusiasm and interest in hearing what he has to say about his 35-year career at Western, as well as his previous years leading up to his decision to become a sociologist before coming to Western. I cannot possibly mention everything that he has listed in his 40-page CV. I was going to bring PowerPoint, but it would have taken the whole hour to go through all 40 pages. So what I'll do is I'll group them in the familiar categories of teaching, research, and service. Anton is well known for his exemplary teaching records. He has received no less than 7 teaching awards, locally, provincially, and nationally. That's some sort of record. I didn't see that on your CV. Maybe Chuck knows whether that's a record or not. He supervised and mentored some 30 graduate students, sat on more than 50 graduate examination committees. In the area of research, Professor Allahar has been a powerhouse. Anton has published 14 books, several of which I had the pleasure of co-authoring. Dozens of journal articles, well over 50. Dozens of book chapters, and he's delivered over 100 conference papers around the world. Anton has served as chief editor for several journals, founding the International Journal of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies, and performed editorial roles for about a dozen other journals. Since 2010, he's been the chief editor for the Caribbean book series at the University of Mississippi Press, where he has shepherded some 24 books. And before this, he was editor-in-chief for Lexington Books for 5 years. On to his inspiring record in service. Anton has made us proud with his involvement in several learned societies, notably the Caribbean Studies Association, where he served as president in 2007, 2008, and was conferred a Lifetime Achievement Award by them in 2014. Not one to rest on his laurels, Professor Allahar has delivered dozens of invited lectures, panel discussions, and keynote addresses around the world. If that weren't enough, Anton has 2 honorary professorships in Cuba and has been a visiting professor at several universities around the world, including Russia, Jamaica, and Barbados. Other service to the community includes organizing some 16 conferences and workshops and delivering over 100 invited lectures to various audiences. There's more, but without further ado, I give you the irrepressible Anton Allahar.
Jim, thank you very much for the kind words. I wrote them. The idea of the ultimate lecture is a ritual that we have in our department. When people are retiring, they will give this supposed last lecture. And I have titled mine, as I have titled it, No Accident Here, Why My Career as a Sociologist was a no-brainer. I take the title from 2 previous ultimate lectures, specifically the last lecture of Sam Clark. Sam is not here. Who called himself an accidental academic. It's kind of strange because his father was the father of Canadian sociology. Anyhow. And then Jerry White, in his last lecture, titled himself not an accidental academic, but an accidental sociologist. I'm not picking on Sam and Jerry, but rather trying to pick up on their ideas, their thoughts, their themes, in order to explain why my sociology was clearly no accident. There may have been some serendipity in what I have done, but it was not accidental. In what follows, I shall attempt to be autobiographical, but as I've done for the entirety of my teaching career, I will make liberal use of anecdotes in talking about my autobiography. The best place to start then is the point at which my individual biography intersected with the wider historical context that nurtured me. For even before I studied sociology formally, my sociological imagination was fired by my lived experiences, Going to university for me was nothing but putting labels onto those lived experiences. I've never denied my own agency, that I can act, I have volition, but those experiences I came to understand structurally through a critical, materialist, Marxist lens. In this sense, naming my experiences helped me to understand them better, and I'm reminded of Betty Friedan in her Feminine Mystique, the first book in the new wave, second wave feminism, where Friedan said, by encountering those suburban matrons in the United States, telling them what their problem was, they were in need of women's liberation, she said, by naming it, they heaved a collective sigh of relief, and finally, now that what was bugging them had a name, they could deal with it, they could chew on it, they could kick it out, they could do whatever with they need their chairs down here, you know. You're so short, I thought you were already seated. Yeah, so going to university helped me to name some of my concerns, some of my issues. In much of what follows then, it will concern my understanding of me, my world, and the determination to make that world a better place than I encountered it, and to leave it a better place now that I am gone, now that I'm old and finished and washed up. To begin, I was born in Trinidad in 1949, and those of you who are mathematically challenged, I am 69 years old. I was brought up in Trinidad, a colony of Great Britain. Today, Trinidad's population is about 1.3 million. I'll be going very quickly because the time is short. About 1.3 million people, made up of about 40% what we call blacks, about 40% what we call Indians, the descendants of the slaves and the indentured servants in those countries. And in a color-conscious society that the colonials created for us, the remaining 20% comprised a smattering of local whites, near whites, half whites, whites by association, pass for whites, browns, light browns, high browns, Victoria's, you know, in Jamaica, in my high brown galta. We have reds, some people who are not quite white. Their skin might be pale, but their phenotype indicates that they got more Afro blood, so they call them reds. Douglas, which is the mixture of an Indian and African person, the Dougla, which is a Hindi word that suggests ambivalence. I don't know my origins because I don't know if I'm black or Indian, and so on. Chinese, Syrians, Lebanese, and Jews. So this is the kind of color-divided, color-conscious society from which I came, and my doctoral student, Ezra, up in the back there, is writing her PhD dissertation that she shall defend next week, Thursday, and she's using the concept of dark whites to describe Portuguese in Canada, second generation, and why they may not have done as well as other Mediterranean people like the Italians, the Greeks, the Spaniards, and so on. What is it about that? But I'll leave that to Ezra. The clear and early sensitivity to race, color, shade, hue, you know, these slight variations, will become relevant as I explain my non-accidental arrival to sociology. Trinidad's major exports are oil and gas that replaced sugar and other agricultural products that defined the colonial economy. Although there are many beautiful beaches, there is no traditional sun, sea, sand, and sex tourism, although Trinidadians have been known to enjoy sex. It was first a colony of Spain. For a while it came under French control, and then a colony of Great Britain. As a colonial subject, I had the best that colonial education had to offer. It was a classical liberal education that prepared me for my future as an academic. We studied and spoke classical Greek and Latin. We spoke them. We read Shakespeare, Molière, and Cervantes, and we memorized the Christian Bible. But more of this later. Right now, I want to look back a bit and try to share a few experiential moments from my life and attempt to blend them into a narrative that explains to you how I happened to become a sociologist and why it was no accident. As an historical sociologist, TJ, I always seek to use history as hindsight that provides insight for me to gain foresight. This is my historical materialist education. This is my exposure to Marx. Further, because history is not linear, I am going to move back and forth in history as I choose my anecdotes. I will begin. Some of you are old enough to remember the movie and the song The Summer of 42. Mine was The Summer of 62. Okay? 1962, 1961, 62 was a fateful year for me in terms of defining who I am and what I came to do. I was 13 years old and just about to enter high school. That summer was full of excitement and anticipation, for on August 31st of 1962, Trinidad and Tobago were to become independent of Great Britain. The future Prime Minister was a brilliant, black, Oxford-educated historian, Eric Williams. My former students in this room will all be familiar with his widely famous Capitalism and Slavery, his doctoral dissertation at Oxford, which went on to revolutionize how we think about capitalism and the role slavery played in that. Williams was not shy about playing the race card as he paved our way to independence, but he was a colonial, and in that sense, he valued, he admired, he loved things white, British, and European. There's one of the contradictions that you find in the colonial mentality. As a populist politician, however, while our white colonial masters were exiting the country, the colony, Dr. Williams addressed or announced publicly, quote, "Massa Day done," unquote. The day of the master is over, is what he was claiming. Independence was going to be black in complexion. In other words, as the master was leaving, we were now in charge of ourselves. Maître chez nous, as the Québécois were to say one decade later in Canada. Masters in our own home. Williams was saying this 10 years earlier to us in Trinidad. Independence was black in complexion for not only the Prime Minister, but the Chief Justice, the head of the Public Service Commission, the Police Commissioner, the Chief Fire Officer. All of these used to come from Britain before, under colonialism. And all the ministers of government were not only to be Trinidadians, they were to be black. As my good friend David Trotman, I don't know if David is watching, this is an international telecast going on here of some form. Dave Trotman said to me, he's a professor of history at York University, in the new Trinidad, in the national portrait of the new Trinidad, the Indian was strangely painted out. The national portrait did not feature the Indian or the descendant of the East Indians. Like the faces in that portrait, the culture and symbols that were depicted were decidedly Afro. I looked then, more or less as I look now, so in that national portrait, I belonged to the 60% that was painted out. For although many bloods coursed through my veins, the stubborn fact is that I appear physically more Indian than Douglas or black. So I had some questions of myself as I began to meander my way into sociology. What race was I? What race am I? What is race? Where do I belong? To the new Trinidad that was black or elsewhere? Was I black, or rather black enough, for the new independent reality? What did black mean? If black is beautiful, Ezra, is the blacker you are, the more beautiful you are? How could I be Indian when I knew nothing of India? These were the confusions that attended me in 1962, 13 years old. Racially, I was assigned an identity in Trinidad of an Indian. That was a sign given to me. My asserted identity, racially, was total confusion. Dr. Williams, however, at independence, he spared me the anguish for the moment. For once he was secure in the support of the black masses in the country, he started to play the nationalist card. He had the black support, he now wanted the Indian and the Jew and the Syrian and the Lebanese and other things. So he started talking more in terms of nationalism than in terms of race. We were to be a nation, so we needed a national flag, national colors, and a national anthem. As school children, Dr. Williams gave us a voice. He brought us into the discussion, and we voted on the colors. We voted on what the anthem will be. We voted on the design of the flag. He made us feel that we had a personal stake in this project, and we loved it up. Nationalism was camouflaging for the while racism. I put my racial identity on hold, on the back burner, as it was much more comfortable to cultivate a sense of national belonging rather than harping on racial division and racial exclusion. But, as I will explain presently, the race matter festered until a unique, serendipitous historical event rescued me. This is my hope, right? You're going to stay. Can't go until you hear what this event is. To build up to that event, I will recount two other formative experiences in this fateful year, 1961-62. It was my first year at high school. I was really bright. I started high school at 13 when most of you started at 14. I went to St. Mary's College, which is better known as the College of Immaculate Conception, CIC, which was generally held to be the best high school in the entire country, if not the region. From its very name, as you may guess, it was a Catholic school, and all my teachers were Irish priests imported from Ireland, themselves colonial subjects. They were Jesuits of the Holy Ghost order, and they were brought from Ireland to Trinidad to teach us in the English fashion. I got into that school, I would say, through the back door, thanks to one of my aunts who was in with the priests. You know, some people go to the church and they go to this and they do stuff and they clean, and so my aunt was pretty good and she would bake and give the priests cakes and bread, so I got it. I had the grades, but I did not have the color nor the class qualification at that time to be at CIC. For although not racially homogeneous, the majority of my schoolmates were local and foreign whites. The local whites would be the descendants of the English colonials who stayed and who married and so on locally, and the other set were the children of the Americans from the American military base in Trinidad coming out of the Second World War and so on. So they tended to be the ones who populated the school more so than others. And in a system where color is currency, where your color can be parlayed into jobs and so on, the lighter complexions meant that they would be more likely to be socially and occupationally mobile than others. CIC, my high school, catered to the middle and upper classes in the society. My class location at the time would probably be coded as lower middle class. My father worked as a shipper receiver at the US multinational corporation Alcoa, and my mother worked as a typist, clerk typist, or clerk as you say in Canada, for the Canadian Manufacturers Life Insurance Company. Because I was something of an ethnic and class interloper at CIC, during my 5 years there, I never once had a classmate come to my home or to my neighborhood to lime, to hang out, for whites lived separately, shopped separately, partied separately, and tended to date and marry separately. Sounds like I'm talking about Barbados, Leanne. There was a sprinkling of local whites in our neighborhood on the street and so, and we were always courteous on both sides, but interaction never went far beyond hello and good morning. My teenage mind witnessed these things, processed and filed them, but did not yet quite arrive at a conclusion about what they meant. Later, however, they would explain why my gravitation toward a sociological career could not be accidental. Apart from gaining admission to CIC, the other formative experience of that year had to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I remember the priests coming into the classrooms, taking all of the boys, it was an all-boy high school, out and marching us to the chapel and making us pray for 3 days. We get in the morning, you pray until lunch, then you go home for lunch, you come back and you pray until school is over for 3 days. In those days we were praying that Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, the then leader of the Soviet Union, not unleash communism on us. Cuba is very close to Trinidad. It's all that same body of water. The priests explained very graphically how evil the communists were. After all, they wanted to kill God. And though turning a blind eye to the Nazis, the popes, I'm talking here Pope Pius XI and XII, the popes permitted the Nazis to do what they were doing in Germany, Poland, and other places at the time. Communism, however, was a far greater threat to Catholicism than Nazism. I was young and impressionable, and back in those days I still believed in God. But the beliefs began to crumble in our independent Trinidad, where everything else was black, and we started to wonder, why was God still white? After all, Charlton Heston was God. He was Jesus. In a complicated way, Jesus is Son of God and God. You figure it out. Jesus had white skin, a pink face, blue eyes, and a red beard. Blonde hair too. But if he were really Semitic, he would look more like than Charlton Heston. No? But as I say, figure it out. The priests were genuinely scared. They were frightened, and they communicated their fear to all of us, especially the communists in Cuba. My personal reaction, however, had an unintended consequence. For I am the kind of person, you see, when scared, instead of running away, I run toward that which scares me in an attempt to understand, to demystify, to unpack it. So I ran to the Cuban Revolution and attempted to read any and everything I could about those evil communists. Thanks to my colonial condition, I could read Spanish, French, and English. In my reading, I engaged the most flamboyant and effervescent of the figures among the revolutionaries: Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, Celia Sanchez, and Vilma Espín. I was seduced by the romantic David and Goliath story that was the revolution, and I came, as I said, unintended, I came to identify with the revolutionaries. They held a certain tough guy image, a radical romantic charm that, like the American cowboy, resonated positively with a teenage boy. I found myself asking whether the priests could have been mistaken or were just plain out lying to us. Nevertheless, the hold on me was firm, the hold of the Cuban Revolution. And when I got to university, every time I had an assignment, an essay to write, it would be about Cuba. In my economics classes, the economics of the revolution. In my literature, the literature of the revolution. History of the revolution, and sociology, etc. Thus, what began with possible lies to a 13-year-old boy in 1962 culminated with a PhD in 1981. Serendipity met destiny, perhaps, but still no accident. The colonial experience in the Caribbean was unique, and it did not follow the same path or paths as those which were imposed on the natives of North America. Of course, there were similarities. Any colonial subject will tell you this, especially colonial subjects from the African continent, from the Indian subcontinent, the Caribbean, South America, and so on. There were certain similarities that we colonial subjects shared. We were socially inferior, we were ugly, we were useless, dumb, and incapable of governing ourselves. They drilled this into us, they schooled it into us in different ways. In all of this, class domination is buttressed by what I call colonial mischief, where the racial scars of empire and the politics of race, color, shade, ethnicity, and culture figured prominently. These are the fertile lands in which the seeds of my sociology were sown. And whether we are talking about the British in India and the Caribbean, the French in Africa or Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia or South Africa, or the Spaniards in Central and South America, etc., we cannot deny the pivotal role played by race in the building and consolidation of empire. And let us not forget, Canada and the United States are direct creations of this process. Just saying. Race was the main weapon of domination wielded by the colonials, and it continues to haunt us right into the modern era. Police racial profiling, carding, Chrissy, Black Lives Matter, and racist, Nazi wannabe as a US president, Chrissy. Last night at a meeting of the leaders of the different political parties in Ontario, Liberal and so on and so forth, they were speaking to a group of black people in Brampton or Mississauga, and they all endorsed the idea that racism in Ontario, if not in Canada, is systemic. Not individual racists running around, it's systemic. It's built into the fabric of the society, people's thoughts and dreams and desires and so on. So there are people who are in denial about the extent to which racism persists, who would like to say they're individual racists, but as a whole, the system is free of it. I'm just telling you, listen to your political leaders of last night. To give a sense of the colonial ethno-racial, I'm jumping back a little bit to make the point in the future, the racial divisions to which I refer, I quote V.S. Naipaul, the 2001 Trinidad Nobel Prize winner for literature. Naipaul is ethnically Indo-Trinidadian, but full of self-hate for Indians, blacks, and most things that smack of Trinidad. Echoing my early thoughts about identity and belonging, Naipaul wrote of the attitudes of blacks and East Indians toward one another on the eve of Trinidad's independence. Shaped according to the divisions of color, race, and class, their complexes of inferiority revealed Trinidadians as trying to measure up to the white master who was departing, even after that white master had left. They're still trying to impress him. V.S. Naipaul, Nobel laureate, wrote, quote, "The Negro has a deep contempt for all that is not white. His values are the values of white imperialism at its most bigoted. The Indian despises the Negro for not being an Indian. He has, in addition, taken over all the white prejudices against the Negro, and with the convert's zeal, regards as Negro everyone who has any tincture of Negro blood." Unquote. Naipaul concludes bitingly that, quote, like, you don't call black people monkeys. He says, quote, "Like monkeys pleading for evolution, each claiming to be whiter than the other, the Indians and the Negroes appeal to the unacknowledged white audience to see how much they despise one another. They despise one another by reference to whites," unquote. That's not me, Nobel laureate. I made a little note to myself that I'll share with you. Pretty fucked up, eh? This is what Frantz Fanon referred to as the epidermalization of inferiority, where one's very skin color comes to symbolize one's inferiority, and where that inferiority is metabolized and seeps into your very epidermis. Your skin comes to be worth less. And not only do the others think so, you think so of yourself. The most controversial essay I've ever published was in 1990, I think, titled "When Black First Became Worth Less," where I discovered that even black people don't like black people because they're black. Okay, but different story. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. And if you're black, stay back, was the reality from which I came. Naipaul does not recognize that he's also describing himself as belonging to what he called a population of mimic men, title of one of his books. He was also a mimic man, just like Eric Williams and so many other black leaders of the day who reluctantly admire the white master. In the spirit of Fanon, therefore, I see this as a mental affliction occasioned by prolonged colonial domination and manifested in a deep desire to please the master by emulation of the latter. A type of behavior pattern that one author termed, quite appropriately, apemanship, like apes, and parrotry. Parrots who just apemanship and parrotry. It may even qualify this attitude, this self-deprecating, self-effacing, self-hating behavior, I want to equate to the Stockholm Syndrome, whereby one comes to identify with one's oppressors and see them as the standard to which one aspires. This is part of the baggage I acquired in Trinidad and brought with me to Canada, and it often makes my white liberal friends uncomfortable when I unpack that baggage and when I raise the issue of Canada being a white dominant society. In what follows then, I'm not speaking to any one of you when I'm speaking to all of you, all of us. So don't feel that I'm picking on you. For the truth is that Canada was founded on the principle of white supremacy and those in denial need only to check with the first First Nations person they meet, and if you don't want to, you can check with me. When I left high school, my father utilized his white contacts at Alcoa, and I got a job at the Royal Bank of Canada. The worst bank, don't go there. In Port of Spain, Trinidad. Like my admission to CIC, you might say, again, I got through the back door into the bank. You must know that in the colonies at that time, black people were not given bank jobs, but as a brown-skinned Indian with a reference from a white American district general manager of Alcoa, I got in, albeit in a lowly clerical position in the collections department, bill paying. My other reference came from an Irish, local white Irish Trinidadian called Johnny O'Halloran, a corrupt local white politician who was a government minister and who was my father's cockfighting associate. I can give you more info on this, but my time is short. Getting a job at the bank was quite an achievement, for it involved wearing a collar and tie and working in modern buildings with air conditioning and lots of white people. On the very first day of my job, as I walked into the bank, the only other black person was the porter, and he told me something I shall never forget. Quote, "Boy, we do not belong on that side of the counter," unquote. He may not have seen me as black, but he definitely saw me as not white. 3 months after I got the job, I was fired. And those early stirrings of racial awareness were further accentuated. The details of the firing are not crucial at this point, but we can talk later if you want. But suffice it to say that the decision was racially inspired. You see, the day I was offered the job, there was another applicant, and we were both given a test on the spot. I beat the other applicant. I had to be offered the job because of my high-powered reference letters. But I got 3 months probation. On the day my 3 months were up, they fired me because I had my elbows on the counter and chewed gum while talking to customers. The day they fired me, the man who fired me was the accountant. He was a local white Portuguese Antiguan. He told me, "We are paying you until tomorrow, but I want you to stay around to show the ropes to your replacement," who turned out to be the same young woman I beat in the test, half white, half Chinese, Trinidadian. The thing started falling into place. The old porter knew exactly what he was talking about when he told me. By my mid to late teenage years, I came to realize that in his assumed racial and cultural superiority, the white colonizers and their local surrogates, like the one who fired me, never looked at us. We were like their local servants. They did not really know what we thought about, what we were capable of accomplishing. Their ambitions for us were very low. The bar was set very low. We, however, looked deeply into their eyes. We saw, as George W. Bush said when he spoke to Putin, "Hi, Kathy." Yeah. We looked deeply into their eyes and we saw their souls. And we knew exactly what they were capable of doing. Their harshness, their sense of entitlement, their capacity for violence, brutality, their obliviousness to the suffering of others. This is a key part of white colonial privilege that encompasses white entitlement. The beneficiaries of such privilege unquestioningly feel that they deserve more than those whom they colonized, whom they dominated. It is timely, therefore, that just last Wednesday, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, a man by the name of Eddie Glaude, G-L-A-U-D-E, chair of African American Studies at Princeton University, wrote in Time magazine, quote, "Near the end of his life, King confronted the uncertainty of his moral vision. He had underestimated how deeply the belief that white people matter more than others was ingrained in the habits of American life," unquote. Ingrained, systemic. That ingrained habit is synonymous with the fact that white privilege is normalized among all men and women, and this is why I ask above, if that is so for Americans, should Canadians be exempt? Don't Canadians have the same affliction? Rhetorical question. Again, don't get angry at me, just asking. It is the same limited understanding of men, in inverted commas, as the Americans employ in their Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and so, 1775-76. When did slavery end? 1865. For 90 years they had black people in slavery and they said we're all equal. The only way out of it, as one of my former students explained, is that if the black people were not men and were not human. That was the only way that you perform those intellectual gymnastics that makes that declaration still apropos today. White privilege meant that the colonizer never really knew himself either. That is what privilege is. When you are privileged, you don't have to worry about the hoi polloi, the rabble, the unwashed masses. The white privileged person never felt the need to look introspectively, to examine himself and to problematize his motives and morals. Today, I recognize that even when I talk to those with colonial mentalities, i.e., they're not colonials anymore, but they have the mentalities, they still cannot recognize themselves. They're unable to take ownership for their atrocities committed in the name of progress and civilization. They remain in deep denial. To continue the story of my non-accidental arrival at sociology, I will recount another episode in my life. It was 1969, the day I was leaving Trinidad for Canada, and my parents took me to the airport. As I walked out to the tarmac, in those days you could do that and walk to the plane and so on, my father called me. Hey, what happened?
Everything is good.
All right. My father called out to me as I was walking away. I was always his favorite child, so he was crying. The other three know it, so it's not a secret. He said, Tonino. And I turned around in my tear-filled eyes, and he said to me, son, when you go to those people's country, his exact words, do not go in search of atmosphere. And with a flick of his wrist, he said, you take it with you. He spun around, and I saw his white shirt and his bowed head disappear into the crowd. It was only much later I came to understand my father's advice. As I headed into those people's country, far away, unknown, foreign, white, cold. Yet, though still in my unsettled colonial mindset, I had that unintended advantage over my host. As a colonized young man moving from a majority black to a majority white society, and armed with a considerable amount of cultural capital from CIC, I discovered that I knew my host better than he, usually a male, better than he knew me. I could play him without his recognizing it, without his knowing it. All of you who have ever had to cope with a situation of powerlessness, who have agency, whether as racial, ethnic minority, a woman, a gay, a Muslim, a Jew, etc., you know what I'm talking about. How you can yassa miss the white folks and you fool them into thinking you're foolish. And in order to survive and to thrive, I had to know him, but he did not have to know me, the master. This is how political animals are made. It is no accident. But back to my father's coded advice, which I took to mean that I should cloak myself with confidence, the kind of confidence that has often been mistaken, in my case, for arrogance, for it enables one to know that they are no better than I. You must always be on your toes, much like, again, the Jew in polite, liberal, anti-Semitic settings. Always be on your toes. And in the years that followed this advice, I think my father served me well. I'll give you one anecdote of the confidence thing. You're my boss. If I'm going on too long, you tell me. Tracy is the chair of our department. She's our boss. At my PhD defense, one of my examiners announced that he was going to come at me from way out in left field. I've never really been a fan of the baseball game, like Bob is, and so I never knew what the hell left field was. And then he said to me, Mr. Allahar, supposing by the grace of God you were to become the Prime Minister of Trinidad tomorrow, what will you do to set that country on the road to socialist development and industrialization? Suddenly I learned what left field was. My dissertation was based on Cuba in the 18th and 19th century, sugar and slavery. The confidence that my father asked me to cloak myself with came flooding to me. And I said, Dr. Zeitlin, I don't understand why you should be so, Ingrid, you know Irving, why you should be so pessimistic. Two things come to mind. One, why are you so pessimistic to think I will need the grace of God to become the Prime Minister of Trinidad? Unlike you, nobody at that exam could react like this. It was a tense moment. The second thing I said, as a thinking man, Dr. Zeitlin, the first thing I'll do is invite you as an advisor to my government. But one of the examiners was stifling that laughter, and it just blurted out with spittle and all kinds of things. Irving turned to me and said, "Touché." He surrendered. I won. My dad was right. In the exchanges, that kind of confidence has always had to be there, because people will take you down. There's another story about it that I will talk about if we have time later on. But back to my story. 1969, I was 20 years old. I migrated to Canada with a grand total of $240 in my pocket. The government at the time in Canada required that you have $600. My only asset at that time was an old car, a Vauxhall Victor, for those of you of English persuasion, that I had. And 3 weeks before leaving for Canada, my car was stolen and it was stripped. Even the gas tank was taken out. And when it was recovered, I got the equivalent of 240 Canadian dollars for it. My father had lost money at the cockfights that weekend. So his mother, my grandmother, transferred to me the equivalent of 360 Canadian dollars into my account at the Royal Bank again. Because all the Canadian banks are there, CIBC, Royal Bank, and so you guys are imperialistic finance capitalists. The bank manager gave me a statement which is good for 24 hours, stamped it. I thanked him, I gave my grandma back the 360, and 6 hours later, immigration officials in Montreal waved me into my future. Canada has been good to me, but it has not been a one-way street. For I have also been good to Canada, part perhaps of my arrogance, but after 41 years of professing, I think some of my 4,000 plus students may just defend me. Don't raise your hands. Over the years, a significant part of my sociological formation, my political maturing, is credited to two unshakable comrades and friends. Horace Enriquez, and I hope Horace is looking at us here, he has not been well, and Jim Cote. Two towering intellects, but salt of the earth kind of people. People with whom you could always let your guard down, you could always relax, you can say what you want, no sensitivity and all of that kind of bullshit that attends so many encounters today. What I learned from Horace and Jim, or perhaps with them, lubricated by gallons of beer and rum, was intellectually indispensable to my sociological formation. I'm speaking of the broad themes of identity and youth studies, probably Jim is the world authority today, and belonging, with which Horace has struggled all his life. As I attempted to situate myself personally, psychologically, and politically, their genuine fellowship has been constant, and although our stories are different, are unique, they complemented one another. In trying to discover myself, who I am, where I belong, I refined my search by adding certain adjectives to identity. Racial, ethnic, national identity. For while my class position was more or less set in Trinidad, my class identity and class politics would crystallize and emerge later in my Canadian sojourn. Sociologically, this makes sense, for the personal is the starting point, after which comes the structural. It is the fact that what happens to one as an individual has a pattern, a repeated manifestation that constitutes the structure. And these were the facets of my identity that kept coming up, so they became part of my mode of inquiry into myself and others. I discovered that I was a Trinidadian only in exile. Only when I came to Canada did I become a Trinidadian. Back in Trinidad, I looked stupid with a bumper sticker saying Trini and proud. Okay? So it was only when you came here that you got that sense of what you left behind. But what did my Trinidadian identity mean? I'll get back. I'm building up to the big event that I told you about, that turned my life around. I'll get back to this presently, but for the moment, that identity revolved around some vague ethno-nationalist sentiments. For the colonial authorities in Trinidad used race and ethnicity and class most effectively to divide us, to rule us, and they put us into all kinds of different categories of mixed phenotypes. We're all mixed to different degrees, but we're all mixed. After independence, our black leaders who took over from the white leaders who left continued the mischief of racial divisions and so on. I was more, in Trinidad, readily identified as an Indian, but my racial identity was not yet fully formed. That would come in the few pages that I have left here to share with you. Like my own upbringing, my own colonial upbringing, Vidya Naipaul's upbringing led him to embrace and cherish the value the things that are white, European, British. Great literature, standards of beauty, music, art, aesthetics, civilization, sporting pursuits, and even good speech and good manners. So that, in one sense, I'm going to make a little jump here. That was some of the baggage that I brought when I came to Canada. I knew I was not Canadian, not only because I was not born here, but because I was not white. I did not look white, did not sound white, although my accent now is pretty perfect. And I was not accepted by Canadians as just another undistinguishable one of them. You know, they're polite, but you're not accepted. Those people, and almost 50 years after my arrival, almost 50 years after official multiculturalism, the situation has begun to change, albeit not completely, for people are still curious after 48 or 49 years here, curious to know, where are you really from? Those politicians I talked about last night acknowledged this. They say it is real, it is alive, it is here with us. No one with white privilege can really understand just how that question rankles. If you have white privilege, I asked in class a couple of years ago, I asked a white woman, how many times in the course of a day do you think of your color and your race? What are you talking about, sir? Never. And I asked a black woman, she said, I can't stop thinking of it. It is with me all the time. That's privilege. You have the privilege not to. How many times does an engineer, a male engineer in the engineering building here, think about his sex? Let's ask the same of a female engineering student, and on and on. We can do this thing as we go. My first real job in Canada was at Honest Ed's, a thrift store that catered to poor immigrants in Toronto. I made $1.19 an hour and worked shift for about 50 hours per week. I lived in a sociologically rich rooming house with 7 rooms where I shared a common kitchen and bathroom with a mysterious Czechoslovakian mafia man, a Russian survivor from World War I, a wino on welfare, 2 student nurses, a sexually active ex-Roman Catholic nun, and my father's only brother. My rent was $5 a week. This is right at the corner of College and St. George. $5 a week, and my entertainment was a rented black and white TV set that cost me $4 every 2 weeks. I purchased my first winter outfit from a second-hand store in the Jewish market called Courage, My Love. The whole thing cost me $10 to $12, and it consisted of a formidable black coat, 2 sizes too big for me, nicknamed the Beast. Winter was afraid of it. A pleather cap with fake fur on the inside that buttoned under the chin, a total giveaway of one's immigrant status. Mismatched vinyl gloves, an itchy gray scarf, I don't know the previous owner what he had in it, and a pair of boots that leaked around the outside of the left foot. My mother would have died to have seen how her son had been reduced. Back home, we had a 4-bedroom house in a very pleasant residential area where it never snowed. 2 cars, a boat, a maid, a gardener, and some social standing. And here I am shopping in a second-hand store for my clothes. Honest Ed Mervish was a lovely man, and he took to me. He was a multimillionaire, he hobnobbed with movie stars, was a patron of the arts, and a philanthropist. While working at Honest Ed's, I often saw other young people who came into the store with their UFT, their York, their George Brown, their Ryerson jackets on, And so on, I said, hell, I could do that too. I had my grade 13, my A levels, but I had no money. So one day I mentioned it to Mr. Mervish, that I wanted to go to school, and to make a long story short, he was most supportive, indeed, so supportive, he paid my first semester's fees of $412 to go to Ryerson as a full-time student in a 3-year liberal arts program. After that, I won modest scholarships, and I combined it with OSAP, plus I continued to work full-time at Honest Ed's. One night, after finishing work at Honest Ed's, I was walking home, South and Bathurst Street from Bloor, heading toward my little room that I called home. It was about 9:30, snow had just fallen, and I jumped over a fence to cut about 5 minutes off my walk through the Central Tech schoolyard. As I jumped the fence, a police car screeched around the corner, came to a halt at Wellesley and Bathurst. 2 big burly officers jumped out. They ordered me back to the fence where they handcuffed me. It turned out that minutes before this, a woman had had her purse snatched in the area, and the only description she could give the cops is that he was a black man. The details of what happened next are not relevant now, but in retrospect they fit into my story. Be patient, I shall not get ahead of myself. I knew hunger in those days, for I was poor, but I was never starving. Besides, I had resolved not to give up and go home. My father, you see, had a close friend, Albert Richmond, a white Trini, whose son had come to Canada before I did, but he could not handle the cold, the isolation, the racism, and the whole experience of being a cultural orphan. His white privilege in Trinidad did not transfer to Canada. White in Trinidad is not the same as white in Canada. So after 3 months, he returned home, and my father and the other friends teased Albert Richmond relentlessly for having raised a quitter, a sissy. You should have raised a man. He would have. So there's no way I was going, because I told you I'm my father's favorite child. No way I'm going home for my dad to take the same ridicule as. So I put up with it, the leaky boots, the hunger, and all of those things. My liminal status in Canada fed my sociological sensibilities that were being forged as my past rubbed up against my present. Much to the chagrin, again, and sometimes the discomfort of certain Canadian friends, my origins in Trinidad have made me finely attuned to the nuances of race and color. And each time I remind them of this, it provokes the standard defensive reaction, but I don't see color. At this point, I must share another anecdote. Back in the mid-1980s, shortly after I arrived in London, Jim Cote, Ed Grab, and I left the grad pub. We had closed it was after midnight, and went downtown to a pub and restaurant called Pickles. Jack, remember Pickles? It was well after midnight, and as these 3 sociologists in a bar at that hour of the morning were enjoying a spiritual disagreement about some aspect or other of government policy, I, of course, was probably louder than Jim and Ed combined. Suddenly, a white guy at an adjoining table fixed his gaze on me and blurted out, quote, "If you don't like it here, why the fuck don't you go back where you came from?" Unquote. Perhaps fueled by Moosehead beer, because Ed liked that, in a flash, Ed was on his feet, rolling up his shirt sleeve and approaching the guy. Jim, too, stood up and moved away from the table in a symbolic gesture which said that he was also prepared to defend me. I intervened. "It's okay, guys. If you start any trouble, I will get the blame." The white guy did not get up, but he elevated his voice, and before I knew it, the manager came over and asked us to leave because I was causing a disturbance. Okay? This is how things work. To return to the question of color and belonging, in time, I came to understand Canada sociologically, not as multicultural, but as monocultural and multi-ethnic. The Anglo-capitalist and Judeo-Christian culture defined the country's institutions and continue to do so today. In other words, not realizing that it is their white privilege, which can be synonymous with Canadian or North American privilege, that permits my liberal friends to claim that they do not see color, they have at times excused me paternalistically for the chip on my shoulder. This is so reminiscent of the guy at Pickles that night. If you think it is strange for white liberals to profess color blindness, stranger still are those people of color who claim that race does not matter, black lives or other. Those are my conservative, what I call Afro-Saxon friends. Non-liberal Canadians, on the other hand, like the guy at Pickles, have never had any difficulty pointing out my physical difference, whether it came from a cowardly voice shouted from a passing bus or something, or from well-meaning folks. There are people who are upset, they're uncomfortable when I say I am black. I'm reminded of the time in a lecture when I did just that, and a young woman sitting at the front of the class raised her hand and protested mildly, "But sir, you don't look black to me, you're not black." I said, "Oh, what then am I?" And she said, "You look rather golden." With a satisfied smile, I turned to the class and clarified that I had never been walking down Richmond Street and had someone stick their head out of the bus and say, "Hey, you golden son of a bitch." I got black, I got khaki, I got all kinds of things, but never golden. Now,
What grade did you get?
she's sitting. So, this is my dilemma. In Trinidad, I'm Indian, not black. In Canada, I'm black, as the episode with the cops and the woman who lost her purse testified. The colonial masters saw me as brown skin, given my good nose, good lips, and in those days I had good hair. And now this young woman thinks I'm golden. I ask you again, now you understand how fucked up I am. The prejudice that accompanies privilege is more subtle. For example, there was a time when I applied for something and I was told that my list of publications, though impressive, did not feature articles in the Canadian, the American, and the British journals, the white journals, the advanced capitalist, civilized journals. The clear implication is that the Cuban, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Latin American, and other third world journals where I had published were not of equivalent intellectual value, by which they mean moral, human. In the fall of 1970, you tired yet? No? Okay. If you guys like this, you say to Tracy, hire him back. In the fall of 1970, I had been in Canada for 1 year. Thanks to Ed Mervish, I was enrolled at Ryerson, where I fell in with a group of black Caribbean students who were very much into black power. I was a founding member of the Ryerson Afro-Caribbean Association, RACA, and we had weekly meetings where we discussed black power, racism in Canada, politics back home, the vagaries of capitalism, and the promise of socialism. Although I was not black in Trinidad, I wondered, could I be black in Canada? The making of the sociologist was clearly underway. In RACA, the early stirrings of my sociological consciousness were boosted. I empathized with my black friends and the trials we all faced as a group, but I was to learn that I was not really black. There was a difference, something I've said to you a lot, Maria, a difference between being black and feeling black, being Italian and feeling Italian. I said, she feels Italian, but once she lands at Da Vinci Airport in Rome, they know she's not from there. Then one day, an incident occurred that told me I had to find my own way. My best friend at the time, I shall call him Len, was half Chinese by his father's side and half black by his mother, Trinidadian. His phenotypical features were decidedly Afro, except for traces of his Asian heritage around his eyes. On the day in question, Len was changing apartments, and I offered to help him pack and carry boxes and so on. We had everything all completed, and we were sitting on the ground. There was no more furniture, and the phone rang. He's speaking to the person on the other end, who obviously had asked him, "What you doing?" And Len's response was, quote, "I'm sitting down here with an Indian partner, mine just all talking," unquote. I am sitting here with an Indian partner just chatting. Obviously, the person had asked, as I said, "What are you doing?" But to Len, he did not say, "I'm sitting here with Anton, with a fellow Trinidadian, with a political ally. We had been arrested by the police together for protesting in Toronto. With somebody from back home." I was an Indian partner of his. That was when I came to see race consciousness as false consciousness, when the idea of class consciousness suggested itself to me as a superior mode of political being. Sure, it was the time of the United States Civil Rights Movement, and the racialization of public consciousness was everywhere, including in Trinidad and in Canada. The revealing thing, however, is that I had never seen Len racially. He was just Len. But he obviously saw me as Indian before Trinidadian. And this harkens back to the above-mentioned scars of empire, where we use race and privilege. Some groups, the Indians in Trinidad, were treated better than the blacks. They were called dark-skinned Caucasians with the good nose and so on. Their kids could be educated. They were permitted to get land, whereas the blacks, the ex-slaves and so, were not. So they set up these invidious comparisons between the two subordinated groups, and they will not get along. The English managed to convince the Indians that they were really brown-skinned Caucasians, and the Indians willingly embraced this, as Naipaul said in the quote earlier. My racial space was even more confusing, but instead of giving up, as I said, I ran to it and tried to understand, what is this thing called race? What race am I? Even if I say to my students, even if you know what race you are, I defy you to tell me what race I am. Because biologically, races don't make sense. Socially, they do. Biologically, they don't. At RACA, the Afro-Caribbean group, we read and discussed many things, but two books in particular turned my life around. Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and Regis Debray, a French journalist, Revolution in the Revolution. Wretched emphasized the race card, and I could relate to that, but my outsider status drove me to need more. Race was not satisfying me. That's where Revolution in the Revolution came into the picture, for Debray focused on my principal passion, the Cuban Revolution, ever since the priest scared the shit out of me, which was the Cuban Revolution about popular mobilization and class politics. The Cuban revolutionaries had put their lives on the line to liberate Cubans of all colors. After that, they put their army at the service of the liberation movements in South Africa, South America, and elsewhere on the African continent, and in Southeast Asia. These were the Cubans, a population at the time of not even 9 million. This is likely why the fellow who invented the word black power, Stokely Carmichael, fellow Trinidadian, explained to me once that the blackest man he had ever met in his life was Fidel Castro. Because black was not the color of skin, but the color of one's politics for Carmichael. On my first ever visit to Cuba in 1976 for the International Youth Congress, white and light-skinned Cubans explained to me that their army was fighting in Angola because that African country was the birthplace of their ancestors. White people telling me this. The proverbial light bulb went off. Class liberation was synonymous with socialist liberation, and it transcended race. I could finally belong. Like the white woman of Betty Friedan's book, the Cubans helped me to name my problem. And once named, it became real. I could embrace it and deal with it. I was very excited, for I was coming to understand the limitations of race thinking, just as Cuba had advanced the class question. Very importantly, I came to understand that capitalism can exist without racism and sexism, but not without class exploitation. And the working class comes in many different colors, sexes, and sexual orientations. This is precisely where my full sociological imagination was born, okay, no accident. I came to understand history not only at the point at which our individual biographies intersect with our wider histories, but my mind and eyes were opened to the centrality of class struggle and in the pursuit of social justice. Just as the priests at CIC spoke about doing unto others as you'll have them do unto you, love your neighbor, and etc., etc. The Cubans were saying the same thing, but they were doing it. The priests never did it. Those popes that I was telling you about who turned a blind eye to the Nazis, and so, they were talking big, not acting the part. Like most young men of the period, I was seduced by the radical charm of the Cuban revolutionaries and their bad boy swagger, unkempt beards, cigar smoking, gun toting, and taking no shit from the oppressors. Massa Day was indeed done for the Cubans. I went back there with Massa Day done. You're not going to tell us in Cuba anymore what to do. We call our own shots. Then, coming to the end, in my final year at Ryerson, I met an amazing professor from South Africa, Solly Patel, who introduced me formally to Marx. He taught me how to read Marx. He taught me how to read and think critically. As a Marxist philosopher, Solly lived the reality of apartheid in South Africa. As a vicious, brutal, hateful system, It had strong ties, apartheid, strong ties with Canada, the US, and Great Britain. My mother always told me I would be judged by my friends. How do we judge Canada when they keep friends with those beasts? Right? We don't want to be judged by being friendly with Putin. Okay? But we were in bed with the apartheid regime. Okay? Don't get vexed with me, I'm just talking. I leave it to you to add the historical shame and embarrassment of the reserves and reservations in this continent. Okay? Who are your friends? And just 2 weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Pope exhibited great intransigence and refused to apologize for the residential schools, one of the greatest stains on Canadian identity internationally. The Pope, I'm not going to. Sali Patel, my South African teacher, knew that the racist oppression of 85% of the South African population was real, and he explained to me why he was a member of the same party, the ANC, African National Congress, to which Nelson Mandela belonged. He taught me how, in the struggle for social justice, class consciousness is fundamental, but we must begin with where people's consciousness is, and in the case of South Africa, it was in race. But we must not, though beginning there, must not end there. Political education must transcend race and must be undertaken to move the masses to a class appreciation of their social condition. I had found my escape tunnel that would lead me to my own liberation as an academic and a social activist. This was no accident. My racial exclusion in Trinidad, where independence was black in complexion, was not my destiny. I began to sharpen my political and intellectual tools, rooted them in the study of history, the Cuban Revolution, and Marxism. Maybe now you'll understand why I'm eager to privilege class analysis over race consciousness. And this is why my sociology was not accidental. To conclude, so here I am. As I leave Western, I hope I can say I leave it a better place than I found it. Only you can tell me. But I've spent half my life here, and for that I thank my colleagues, my students, some administrators, who over the years have allowed me to do my thing more or less unencumbered. I've had a great run. I mentioned my friends, Horace and Jim. I want to add Chuck Levine. Chuck was the best teacher in the department until I got here. But Chuck kept pushing me. For a while he was nipping at my heels, but then I left him so far in the dust. Just joking, Chuck, love you. I've spent half of my life here, and for that I thank my colleagues and so on. I've had a great run. I thank both Canada and Western. As the late Ben Singer used to ask me rhetorically and sarcastically, how could the system be so bad when it's been so good to you? Thanks to all of those who are here, to my CSA friends, mi gente en La Habana, espero que me están mirando allá. This going to the University of Havana too. Those who have come from far away, former students, former colleagues, friends, and so on. Those who took time off work, Gokan, and others. Those who would have liked to be here but who are not here. A special thanks to Amy Jacob, for making all of this happen. The filming, the room, the posters and everything. And Amy is one of the people with whom I can go and talk about anything, anytime. She is so bright. Tracy, you're not only the first woman chairperson we have had, but you're also the most socially skilled and interpersonally talented of the many chairpersons, and some of them are in the room watching me. You are the best. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we go, I just wanted to pass on to Anton a little token from the department. It is something small, really nothing can really reward you, and thank you enough for your 34 years at Western. Thank you for all your outstanding teaching, your internationally renowned scholarship, and your wonderful, being a wonderful department colleague. So we'll miss you very much.
Thank you very much.